We got her!
The Dreamcast! It's remembered as one of the greatest consoles ever to release, home to some of the most creative games ever made, and Sega's triumphant return to console supremacy. I remember the Dreamcast as the first console that I ever pre-ordered and attended a launch for at the tender age of 19. I myself have fond memories of the console. Until this day, it is one of my favorite platforms. It had a fantastically successful launch with a long, bright future ahead of it that was unfairly cut short by its overhyped competition. But is all that true? I mean, beyond all the stuff about me. That's all true. But what about its successful launch? The triumphant return of Sega, its amazing library, and of course, the reason behind its eventual demise. Have we just been wearing rose-tinted glasses? Did I specifically buy these just for this video and wait for them to be delivered before shooting it? Well, I don't know about all that, but what I did do was a little bit of digging and some reflecting. So let's pop those rose-tinted glasses off, examine the details, and take an unbiased look at the Sega Dreamcast, and see why it was the last console Sega would ever release after entering the console business in 1983, 18 years early. First, a little history. During the mid-90s fifth console generation that consisted mainly of the Sony PlayStation, Sega Saturn, Nintendo 64, Atari Jaguar, that's right for a video by the way, and the 3DO, and yes, the 3DO was a player. Sega had taken massive losses after the underperformance of the Saturn, where they had controlled only 12% of the market as opposed to the massive 40 and 47% Nintendo and Sony commanded with their consoles. The failure of the Saturn was due to many factors, chief among those being poor third-party support, difficult hardware to develop for, an overall lack of focus, and mismanagement. After the commercial disappointments of the Sega CD, I Love You, the 32X, and now the Saturn, Sega's reputation and financial records were not in a good place. Unlike other console generations, Sega discontinued the Saturn 6 months before its successor's original Japanese launch, and well over a year before it released in other territories, leaving gamers with no games, and no, not in that Xbox has no games kind of way, literally no games being released for the console during this time, damaging the company's reputation with its fanbase even more, proving that during this time, Sega did not do what Nintendo did, i.e., make games. Knowing that funds were getting thin and they needed a win, that rhymed, Sega set out to design a powerful but cheaper than the Saturn truly next-gen console by using off-the-shelf components. Two teams were working on a Saturn successor, one in America called Black Belt, headed up by IBM's Tetsu Yamamoto, using a Motorola CPU and a custom 3DFX GPU, and one in Japan called White Belt, headed up by Hideki Sato, using a off-the-shelf Hitachi CPU and NEC GPU. The head of Sega of America at the time, Bernie Stoller, felt that the American-developed 3DFX version was better and should have been used. Which makes sense because, you know, his team came up with it and all. But Sega of Japan wanted to use the Japanese version, and Sega of Japan ultimately won because, well, they were in charge. Coincidentally, the Japanese-designed model used an NEC GPU, and NEC is a Japanese company that Sega had close ties with at the time. Not saying that had anything to do with it, because I'm sure it didn't at all. Anyway, due to this decision, 3DFX filed a lawsuit against Sega and NEC claiming breach of contract, which was eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. Also, Electronic Arts,
EA, it's in the game,
was considerably invested in 3DFX and is said to not have been happy with Sega's decision, and due to this, didn't support the platform. As things started to come together with the project, it was renamed Katana, which is about as badass as you can badass. And you can find that moniker on all Dreamcast boards. The Katana board uses a very similar architecture to Sega's popular Naomi arcade boards, making it a Naomi arcade port powerhouse.
Say that 3 times fast.
Sega decided to use the obscure GD-ROM format instead of the new, more expensive DVD-ROM format to save cost and combat piracy. Though this eventually backfired, and due to a loophole in the software, ultimately allowed even easier piracy through the console support of the MIL CD format, which was mainly used for karaoke discs. Sega partnered with Microsoft for the OS using a custom version of Windows called Windows CE, making porting PC games, where most games are developed, easier. This is why you can find compatible with Microsoft Windows CE on the front of all Dreamcast consoles. Sega also bet big on online functionality, including a 56K modular modem
With 56K, connections are faster than ever.
with the console in most regions. And while internet connectivity in a console is expected and the norm now, at the time it was virtually unheard of, with the exception of some niche failed add-ons.
X-Band.
This made the Dreamcast the first home console to include a modem for online play and internet access.
So next time you log into those Call of Duty servers on your X-Station 7, just remember that this is where it all started.
With everything on the hardware front coming together, now it was time to come up with a name. The final name, Dreamcast, came to be through a public competition that had more than 5,000 different entries. Japanese game developer Kenji Eno submitted the name Dreamcast, which is a combination of dream and broadcast. Eno also created the Dreamcast's iconic spiral logo.
Is it iconic? Sure.
Though Eno has never been officially credited by Sega for any of these contributions. Due to the declining reputation of the Sega brand, they had originally planned to remove the Sega name entirely from the console, establishing a new gaming brand much like Sony had with PlayStation.
But be it due to hubris, pride, or something else, management ultimately decided against this.
It would appear that Sega was doing things mostly right this time around, attempting to provide a powerful, developer-friendly console that wasn't rushed to market prematurely. Even with the massive losses on the Saturn, Sega was confident about the Dreamcast debut with significant outside interest and pre-orders.
Which brings us to
The launch. The Dreamcast was the first 6th generation console released by a healthy margin. 6th gen consisted of the Sega Dreamcast, Sony PlayStation 2, Nintendo GameCube, and Microsoft's original Xbox. Unfortunately, they were unable to meet their shipping goals for the Japanese launch due to a shortage of the PowerVR chipsets caused by a high failure rate of the NEC-developed GPU chips.
yes, the chips that Bernie Stolar had claimed weren't as good as the 3DFX option.
Due to this, Sega stopped pre-orders in Japan much earlier than originally planned. The console officially launched on November 27, 1998 at a price of 29,000 yen, approximately $205 US, and their available stock sold out by the end of the day.
So things are looking good, right? Well,
Even though Sega had announced that Sonic Adventure, the next installment of its popular mascot that never received a mainline entry on the Saturn, would launch with the console, it and Sega Rally Championship 2, the sequel to one of its other popular franchises, were delayed, leaving the console launch with only 4 launch games: Virtual Fighter 3TB, Pin Pin Tri-Icelon,
I can never say that made-up word right.
Godzilla Generations, and July, of which only one, Virtual Fighter 3, sold well. This did not help them in their effort to build a sufficient install base to protect themselves from the arrival of their competitors, mainly Sony and the PlayStation 2. Sega had hoped to sell over 1 million units by February 1999, though due to the shortage of consoles, lack of games, and already damaged reputation of the brand, less than 900,000 were sold by that time. To make matters worse, there were reports of unsatisfied customers returning their Dreamcasts. And not only that, but using the refund to purchase PlayStation products. Sega did, however, see some success with the release of more games such as the aforementioned Sonic Adventure, Sega Rally Championship 2, Soul Calibur, and its first bona fide hit, the quirky and very Japanese Seaman.
No, not men, man. Get your head out of the gutter.
These releases and price reduction to 19,000 yen, approximately $135 US, right before the US release, did increase sales and help Sega gain 17% on its shares. But with the price reduction, the console was now unprofitable, and profitability was one of the main goals behind the console, and something Sega sorely needed at the time. The original Japanese launch was tepid at best, with too few games and a lackluster ad campaign.
However, things were about to start looking up across the pond. But Not before a few more punches to the face.
The US Dreamcast release was met with a major blow before its launch in the form of EA Chief Creative Officer Bing Gordon announcing that EA, the largest video game publisher in the world at the time, would not develop games for the platform due to Sega flip-flopping on the hardware configuration, saying that Sega was not acting like a competent hardware company. Gordon also said that Sega wouldn't give EA the kind of license that EA has had over the past 5 years,
which would see EA as having exclusive rights as the only sports game developer on the platform.
This was out of the question, seeing as how Sega had just spent $10 million on the purchase of Visual Concepts, a new sports game developer. While Visual Concepts' 2K series of sports games would fill the void of EA sports titles on the platform, and many considered them to be superior games, the loss of EA's brand power of titles like Madden NFL was definitely felt.
Things, once again, were not looking so good for Sega's new console. All that being said, the US launch was much more successful than the Japanese launch. Like, much more.
Sega of America did a much better job with the launch than Sega of Japan by providing 18 games and more stock to meet demand, even going as far as offering Hollywood Video customers the opportunity to rent the console pre-launch. Sega of America also teamed with marketing firms Fucon and Belding and Access Communications to develop the popular marketing campaign.
I remember not knowing what the hell It's Thinking meant in regards to the console, but it was intriguing.
The Dreamcast launched in North America on September 9th, 1999 for $199.
That's a whole lot of nines.
$99.99 for $199 in fact. Over 9 months,
there's another 9,
after the original Japanese launch. Sega sold more than 225,132 units in 24 hours, earning more than $98.4 million, making it, at the time, the biggest 24 hours in entertainment retail history. Sales crossed 1 million units within 2 months, and Sega commanded 31% market share of the North American video game market by Christmas 1999, which isn't bad considering the company's standing at that point.
Overall, the North American launch was substantially more successful than the Japanese launch and exactly what Sega needed. But misfortune wasn't quite done with Sega.
The Dreamcast released in Europe a little over a month after the US launch on October 14th, 1999, and almost a year after the original launch. While the launch was successful and better than the Japanese launch, it didn't soar to the heights of the US release. The console had a 25% price drop 11 months after release in hopes of spurring sales, but this did little to really help, and the console sat at only about 1 million units sold in Europe in its first year. Furthermore, the launch didn't go so well in other territories either, such as Australia and New Zealand, where, according to some, because of Australian customs services, it launched with major internet compatibility issues, console shortages, missing features, only 5 launch games, virtually no additional peripherals such as controllers, etc., and an astoundingly high price point of $499 Australian, approximately $335 US, $135 more than the $199 US release.
Holy shit, you Aussies must be loaded.
To add insult to injury, 2 major Australian retail chains reported that a combined total of only 13 Dreamcast units were sold in the first few days after launch.
And honestly, that seems like a feat unto itself, though not the kind of feat that Sega was hoping for.
While the console is looked at as having a strong start, which it did in some territories such as the US, it definitely had many struggles from the start in other territories such as Japan and Australia. Even with these struggles though, it can't be understated that the console was thriving in the US market, which was the biggest market in the video game space at the time, only being overshadowed by China today, though the console never officially released in the behemoth market of China due to a complete ban on video game consoles the country's government enacted during this time that wasn't lifted until 2015.
Yeah, you heard that right. 2015. What the fuck, China?
So with a reasonably successful launch, all but with its hurdles, the Dreamcast was available to the masses. So now the question was, what would those masses think of the new console?
Which means it's time to look at
the reception. The console had a fantastic and varied launch lineup in the US consisting of Air Force Delta, Arrow Wings, Blue Stinger, Kart, Flag to Flag, The House of the Dead 2, Hydro Thunder, Monaco Grand Prix Racing Simulation 2, that's a mouthful, Mortal Kombat Gold, NFL Blitz 2000, NFL 2K, Pin Tri-Icelon, there's that word again, Power Stone, Ready to Rumble Boxing, Soul Calibur, Sonic Adventure, TNN Motorsports Hardcore Heat, that sounds dirty, Tokyo Extreme Racer, and we know it's extra extreme because of the obligatory 90X, and Trick Style. One of the things that the console was praised for was how it continued Sega's penchant of interesting and quirky peripherals, with add-ons such as the fishing reel and rod motion controller, VMU, keyboard and mouse, and microphone. Not to mention the, at the time, unorthodox inclusion of the modular 56K modem. One of the cooler features of the Dreamcast that many praised was its interesting storage method.
While other consoles of the time were relying on expensive memory cards for the storage of game saves and the like, the Dreamcast had the VMU, or Visual Memory Unit, an expensive memory card for storage of game saves and the like, with a built-in LCD screen and small controller inputs.
The VMU was more than just a memory card. Instead of connecting directly to the console like other memory cards of the day, it connected to the individual player controller, and it allowed the user to play game-specific mini-games that added to their progress within the main game.
On paper, this was a cool idea, and in some cases it worked, such as the Tamagotchi-like minigame included in Sonic Adventure, though in most cases the feature was underused, if just not used at all.
Something else the VMU did was adding an extra informational screen during gameplay. This feature was better utilized and did add some benefit to the player, such as displaying your health meter in Resident Evil Code Veronica. You had to enter a separate menu at this point in the series, picking your plays in sports games without other players seeing, and other in-game information at a glance. The VMU could also be connected to certain Sega arcade cabinets, providing the user the option to save their progress and character stats in the arcade for the first time. Though arcades outside of Japan were beginning to become less and less prevalent, so this feature wasn't as lauded in the West. The Dreamcast controller was praised and panned at the same time. It was based off of the Saturn's well-received 3D controller. It was praised for its built-in analog stick and triggers, interesting VMU integration, and button layout, but it was panned for its bulky size, somewhat cheap and awkward feel, odd wire placement, and top-heavy design when loaded with a VMU, rumble packs, and the like.
It's not the best control. The VMU integration does make it stand out, but without that, it's a bit underwhelming. And in 2023, the omission of the second thumbstick is sorely missed.
Overall, the console, especially the US release, was received very well. While there were some concerns about the controller design, most outlets praised its solid launch lineup, affordable power, and truly next-gen design and performance, giving it overall high marks.
Sega and the Dreamcast were riding a much-deserved high, but unfortunately that wouldn't last for too long. Which brings us to the saddest part of this story:
the fall. Sony unveiled its PlayStation successor, the creatively named PlayStation 2, at TGS 11 days after the US launch on September 20th, 1999, and released in Japan the following March, and 6 months later in October 2000 in the US.
Many point to the release of the PS2 as to what killed the Dreamcast, but the decline had actually started before the launch of its biggest competitor.
While the console did have more third-party support than its forebear, the Saturn, it was still limited, most notably missing EA altogether, which hurt the console right out the gate, but especially in the months after launch when titles were a bit more scarce compared to its competition. The view that many consumers had of Sega was not as favorable or trusting as it once had been, due to being burned by the Saturn and the later Genesis years with all of its confusing add-ons, and many were taking a wait-and-see approach this generation when it came to Sega. While these were all factors of the platform's demise, add to those hurdles the fact that everyone knew that the PS2 was on the horizon, and one sees that it wasn't the launch of the PS2 that killed the Dreamcast, but the sheer anticipation or hype of its arrival. Once the PS2 finally did release, interest in the Dreamcast and sales further declined. Blockbuster Video, the biggest rental outlet at the time, stopped offering Dreamcast titles altogether upon the PS2's release. This was during a time before widespread digital downloads, when video game rentals played a huge part in the console's popularity.
I in fact managed a Blockbuster Video when this decision was made, and as a Dreamcast fan, as we removed all of our stock, all I could think was, what the fuck?
Seeing as how the Dreamcast games were now not available to rent at the largest rental shop around, many owners lost their main way of experiencing new titles, and the console was pushed even further out of the masses' consciousness.
This little talked about move cannot be understated when mentioning the fall of the Dreamcast.
Sega had amassed massive debt, and its last-ditch effort console was taking some major hits. Sega's new CEO, Asawakawa, had for some time advocated for the company to leave the console business, echoing Sega's co-founder David Rosen, who had always said that it was a bit folly for them to be limiting their potential to Sega hardware. And before things could go bad and crash and burn, the company dropped a bombshell, announcing suddenly on January 31st, 2001, that they would be abandoning the hardware business and restructuring the company as a platform agnostic agnostic third-party developer.
From there, things moved fairly quickly.
The Dreamcast was officially discontinued on March 31st, 2001, with the final Dreamcast unit manufactured being autographed by the heads of all 9 of Sega's internal game development studios, plus the heads of Visual Concepts and Sega's sound studio Wavemaster, and given away with 55 first-party Dreamcast games to a competition organized by GamePro magazine and is probably worth about $1 gazillion today. The console's price was dropped multiple times over the next few months in order to clear out stock, dropping as low as $49.95 in the US, and after all was said and done, the console sold a worldwide total of 9.13 million units. Official games for the Dreamcast continued to release after its discontinuation in Japan for a while, however releases ceased in the US midway through 2002.
I remember holding out hope that this decision would be turned around, but that hope would fade into disappointment and eventually acceptance.
And I would be forced to give up the ghost and move on to greener pastures. On a final positive note for Sega, not Dreamcast owners, after 5 consecutive years of financial losses, Sega finally posted a profit for the fiscal year ending March 2003.
And with that, the Dreamcast was dead.
That being said, even though the Dreamcast ended over 20 years ago now, there are still games being made for it till this day in the homebrew scene. And a whole new generation is starting to come around to this interesting little white box they've heard so much about.
The mod scene for the Dreamcast, both hardware and software, is healthy, and you get a heavily modded Dreamcast that pretty much all of the original hardware, with the exception of the motherboard, Katana, has been replaced with updated modern hardware. Hell, even the lackluster controller issue's been remedied with the Retro Fighter Striker DC pad. With all that said, there's really only one more thing to talk about before closing this thing out. And that is, of course, the reason you buy a console to begin with. I bet you thought I forgot.
The games. There were over 600 officially released games across all regions in the Dreamcast catalog.
And while like any console, it had its stinkers, it did in fact have a large amount of great, if not all successful games.
While I won't go through them all, some of the more popular highlights would be Sonic Adventure, the mascot's first and best, according to many, 3D adventure and best-selling Dreamcast game at 2.5 million units. While like many Dreamcast games, its controls are a bit archaic at times by today's standards, Sonic's first jaunt into 3D was a great semi-open world romp with set pieces that stunned in 1999 and still do today. Sonic Adventure 2. Many consider this late in the console's life release to be the quintessential 3D Sonic game, taking all that was right from the first game and elaborating on it and fixing its shortcomings. While I do think the game is great, I still prefer the first game overall, warts and all. But Sonic Adventure 2 is still a fantastic way to experience the blue blur in 3 dimensions. Soul Calibur. As far as launch titles go, Soul Calibur has to be one of the greatest, up there with the likes of Mario 64, Halo, Call of Duty 2, and Breath of the Wild.
Yes, a fighting game stands up with all those iconic titles.
The tight controls, wonderful gameplay, and fantastic graphics that still stand up today were enough, but add to that the extremely,
that's extreme with an X, it was the 90s after all,
addictive campaign mode that even non-fighting game fans can get into, and what you've got is one of the best fighting games and launch games ever made. Grandia 2. The Dreamcast library of RPGs may not have been as big as its competitors, but what it did have were pretty phenomenal. Grandia 2 was the RPG that got me into JRPGs, and yes, I have been playing video games for around 15 years at that point. But RPGs, most of which were of the J variety at the time, just weren't my thing. Grandia 2 changed all that though. Overall, the game is fairly standard JRPG fare, but the presentation and always fun battle mechanics are fantastic. Some of the magic spells and their visual representation in this game are insane. You can drop the moon on your opponent at one point.
The fucking moon!
The game was a blast from beginning to end, and I recommend it to any JRPG fan, and even those of you out there that may have always wondered what all the fuss was about the genre. Skies of Arcadia. When it comes to great RPGs, Skies of Arcadia has to be a part of the conversation. I would even go as far as to say that this is the best JRPG ever made, in my opinion.
Come at me, Final Fantasy VII fans.
It's standard JRPG fare, but holy shit, it's never been done better than it has been here. The world, the characters, the story, the gameplay, the look, everything here is done so damn well. If there's ever been a game that deserved a sequel that seems like it just won't happen, it's Skies of Arcadia. It's downright criminal criminal that we only have one of these games. Of all the great games on the system, Skies of Arcadia is my favorite overall by a healthy margin. If you haven't played this game, go play it now. There was a port on the GameCube that added a minuscule amount of content and doesn't have as good a sound, that is a bit easier to acquire, but even that one commands a hefty price tag today. And for some reason, this game has never been ported over to any other platform. If there's one game worth seeking out, it's Skies of Arcadia.
Yes, it's that good.
Resident Evil. Code Veronica. The Dreamcast received solid ports of Resident Evil 2 and 3 Nemesis, but the RE crown jewel was the, at the time, exclusive Resident Evil Code Veronica. Code Veronica was originally conceived as the third entry in the series, but after the success of the second game, Capcom decided to make Nemesis, a somewhat companion piece to Part 2, the official third game. Code Veronica is the first to have 3D backgrounds, a camera that follows the character, and a huge update to the graphics engine. After the lukewarm reception of Nemesis, Code Veronica was a fantastic return to the series' roots, while at the same time moving the series forward. For RE fans, this is one of the best RE games around and has been woefully overlooked for the recent remake treatment that the first 3 games
And the forthcoming, at the time of this recording, 4th game.
have received. Fortunately, the game has been ported to multiple platforms now, so it's more readily available than some of the other games on this list. Crazy Taxi 1 and 2, spot-on ports of the simple yet addictive arcade hit. There's not much substance here, but man, there's a ton of fun to be had, and the sequel adds a few extra fun modes to extend its lifespan. The NFL 2K series. The first real competitor to the juggernaut that is Madden NFL, the NFL 2K series was thought by many to be the superior sports ball game.
While the genre was never really my thing, I can appreciate the fantastic graphics and realism that are on display here.
The series even offered online multiplayer with 2K1 before Madden. The series ran strong on other platforms for years after the Dreamcast's demise, even with EA purchasing the exclusive rights to the NFL brand in video games for a period of years. Like I said, it's not my cup of tea, but if you're a sports game fan, this series is probably for you. The NBA 2K series. Much like its NFL counterpart, the NBA 2K series was lauded as a landmark in the genre. The series was seen as the superior option by many and is running strong till this day, topping charts each year. House of the Dead 2, an arcade-perfect port of the highly successful Sega arcade game House of the Dead 2, is a great light gun shooter. The only real issue with the game isn't really with the game itself, but with the decision Sega made to not release its official light gun peripheral in the US due to recent gun violence in the country. There were third-party options such as Mad Catz, but these weren't of the highest quality. The game is playable with a controller,
But come on, who the hell wants to do that?
the official Japanese light gun can be imported and does work with the US Dreamcast system, but unfortunately it is locked out of working with the US release of House of the Dead 2. So if you're interested in playing this one, I would suggest importing a Japanese copy and the light gun. As with other light gun games, you'll need a CRT for it to work though. Virtua Tennis. While I've never been much of a sports game fan, Virtua Tennis is one of those games that transcends its genre a bit. Kind of like the fantastic Fight Night Round 3 on the Xbox 360. Am I a tennis fan? No. Is this a tennis game? Yes. Do I love it? Yes, absolutely. Virtua Tennis is just such a well-made, fun, and accessible game that you can't help but have fun with it. Granted, half the time I don't know how I'm doing score-wise, but I do know that I'm having a hell of a good time either way, and apparently spreading a whole lot of love. Shenmue. As one of the most well-known games to come out of the system, Shenmue earns its legacy. It's a hard game to categorize. It has adventure mechanics, but it's not an adventure game. It has simulation mechanics, but it's not a simulation game. It has open world mechanics, but I wouldn't classify it as a traditional open world game either. Then what the hell is it?
I don't know.
But it is an experience. Ultimately, it's a cinematic experience where your character, Ryu, goes on a revenge quest to find his father's killer. It's not your traditional telling either, really delving into the day-to-day details of such an affair. The game has its issues, but it's such a unique experience with some truly groundbreaking, at the time, elements to it you can't help but be entertained. We're talking about a game that forces you to get a job in order to progress the story. And not just get a job, but actually perform said job for weeks. You may not love every minute of it, but you will remember it. Metropolis Street Racer. This interesting little racer was known for having fantastic vehicle models and a unique point system that ran through every aspect of the game. The Kudos system. Developed by a newer little UK studio, you earn these points for everything you do in the game, especially being stylish. The game was less about winning and more about how you win, and was a unique twist on the tried and true racing genre. If all this sounds a bit familiar, that's because that little studio was Bizarre Creations, and this was the forebear to the popular Project Gotham Racing series on Microsoft's Xbox platform some years later. While not quite as refined as those later games, MSR is still a uniquely fun ride. Echo the Dolphin. Another first-time jump into the third dimension, Echo the Dolphin hadn't been seen since the Sega CD. The jump to 3D gave us a huge, beautiful world to explore as the titular dolphin.
And when I say beautiful, I mean beautiful.
This was one of the best-looking games around at the time, and while dated now, it still stands up pretty good. The story's in line with what we had come to expect from an Echo game, so if that's not your thing, this one's not gonna change your mind. This was an extremely relaxing game to play at times, though that zen could be disrupted by the finicky controls that were serviceable but not the best. Virtua Fighter 3TB. I never loved Virtua Fighter. That being said, I never hated it either. I was very middle of the road with the series. I realize that a lot of people do enjoy the series though, and I will say that 3TB is the most fun I've had with it, and it's never looked better. The game was also a big seller in Japan, and it is loved by many. Dead or Alive 2. The DOA series was kind of like the trashy cousin of the more sophisticated Virtua Fighter. She's pretty shallow and doesn't have as much depth, but she is fun, and oh man, trashy or not, she's a looker.
Like in that Kesha kind of way.
She's trashy as hell, probably pretty dirty, and you don't want to admit it to anybody, but she is exotically hot. It doesn't hurt that the gameplay is pretty fun too, and boob jiggle. Never underestimate the boob jiggle. Power Stone 1 and 2. A solid Smash Brothers-like Capcom game with fast-paced 4-player action and fun gameplay. Is it going to replace Smash Brothers? No, but its less cutesy approach is a welcome distraction with tons of fun and 4 players on the same couch. Marvel vs. Capcom 2. It's exactly what it's selling, an arcade-perfect port of the arcade Capcom fighter hit MVC2. If you enjoyed the arcade game, you'll love this. Spider-Man. This was a multi-platform game that didn't really add anything new to the Dreamcast version, but this was the best running and looking version of the game available. It may not hold a candle to something like Spider-Man 2018 in the gameplay department. It is, however, a great representation of these characters and a fun, solid webhead adventure, especially for the time. Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver. I hadn't played the original Legacy of Kain when I was introduced to Soul Reaver, and thankfully you don't have to get into this one. This is a fantastic Metroidvania 3D adventure game with awesome gameplay, an engaging story, and a creative world that keeps everything fresh throughout its long runtime.
There's a reason that you still hear people talk so fondly about this game 20 years later, even though there's been sequels.
The sequels were good, but Soul Reaver was awesome. Daytona, USA. This one shouldn't need any introduction to anyone who's ever stepped foot in an arcade. Hearing that iconic Rolling Stone and the Daytona theme will transport you right back to those smoke-filled, dimly lit bastions of fun, and better yet, this is the best version of the game, even outshining the arcade original in the graphics and features department. It's Daytona USA. It's fast, loud, over-the-top arcadey fun. What more do you need to know? Choo Choo Rocket. This is a quirky little puzzle game that is highly addictive and perfectly encapsulates that just one more level style of gameplay. This game tasks you with using a limited amount of directional tiles to get all of your mice to the escape rocket without running into a cat. It's fairly simple and great fun, but its true claim to fame is that it was the first official online console game allowing up to 4 players to try and collect the most mice in a frantic race to their rockets. Phantasy Star Online. The Dreamcast was a host to a lot of firsts, and PSO was one of those, being the first online console RPG. A grind-happy dungeon crawler at its heart, this was the first online game and online RPG that I ever played extensively. there's a story here, but it's fairly shallow. PSO is all about the grind and working as a team. Its addictive, deep gameplay saw me sink hours upon hours of my early 20s into this game, forming some online friendships that spanned multiple consoles and lasting for years to come. The Dreamcast was also home to some truly different, innovative, and just outright strange games.
While there are many, here's a few of my top picks of some truly odd titles that are worth checking out. Starting with a game that's as well known for its odd, if not questionable, title as it is its truly strange gameplay. And of course, I'm talking about
Seaman. Go ahead, get it out of your system.
Done? Alright, good. Let's move on.
Seaman is a virtual pet simulator where you meticulously raise a strange half-man, half-fish frog creature. If that's not odd enough, the game came packaged with a microphone that you plugged into the controller so that you could talk to your Seaman, and it would talk back to you. Yeah, it's a game where the main gameplay element is that you hold conversations with a mutant man-frog. Oh yeah, and Mr. Seaman, he's not so nice. The majority of your interactions with the creature consist of him talking shit and deprecating you. The voice recognition and responses are actually pretty varied and well done. This is an odd experience, but it is an experience that is guaranteed to be unique. Leonard Nimoy is the narrator also, so there's that. Jet Set Radio! Jet Set Radio, or Jet Grind Radio in the US,
Because all that setting was just too much for the youths over here.
is a semi-open world graffiti tagging game. Does it sound too interesting? Well, let's add skates to the mix. But not just skates, but skates with jets on them, and a hyper-stylized future setting of Neo Tokyo, because that just sounds cool. And honestly, it is. That's what this game is. It's just cool. The fun grinding and tagging mechanics while you run or skate from the police, mixed with the super cool stylized cel-shaded graphics and the absolutely awesome neopunk soundtrack, make JSR an absolute blast. And while other tagging games have come since, nothing has been able to match JSR's mix of attitude, fun, and pure coolness. Space Channel 5. Do you like Parappa the Rappa? Do you wish it had more aliens, less rap, and more pop? A bit more pre-adolescent sexiness? Well, Space Channel 5 and its Japanese-only sequel have got you covered. Space Channel 5 is a very Japanese rhythm game, nothing more, nothing less. A lot of your enjoyment, or tolerance, of it will be based on your appreciation, or lack thereof, of the music, which is an interesting mix of modern pop with a heavy 1960s twang. It does have a James Bond super cool vibe coursing through it and never takes itself serious in the slightest.
It's about as shallow as your average TikTok video, and you're probably not going to get too much mileage out of it.
But what you do get will be a memorable, interesting good time. Typing of the Dead. It's House of the Dead, but with a keyboard. Typing of the Dead has got to be one of the most fun forms of edutainment available. You have to type a variety of words and phrases to shoot the zombies, and some of those phrases are pretty out there. The House of the Dead series has always been kinda quirky, but this is definitely the quirkiest thing the series has ever done. But it's actually really fun, and you really can learn a valuable skill in the process.
One that till this day, I still suck at.
Playing the game on original hardware today could get pricey given the price of the Dreamcast keyboard, game, and the console, but it has been ported over to other platforms such as PC that make it a bit more accessible now. The sequel, Typing of the Dead Overkill, is available on Steam and is an absolute insane blast. Samba de Amigo. Before there was Guitar Hero, there was Samba de Amigo. Pretty much the same idea, but with maracas and a hint of dancing. The game features a more South American vibe than its contemporaries, and the music is made up mostly of remixed versions of popular Latin music such as Ricky Martin.
Don't judge, he was big at the time.
It's a fun, energetic game that will get you off your ass with some catchy tunes. The required maraca controllers were, and still are, a bit pricey, making the barrier to entry a bit high. There is, however, a port on the Wii that doesn't require them that is still fun, but using the real maracas controllers and dance mat to play this game is an experience that can't quite be matched. And it's always fun to watch people flail around like idiots while playing these types of games. Sword of the Berserk, Guts Rage, or as it's known in Japan,
Berserk, Millennium Falcon Arc, Chapters of the Flowers of Oblivion.
Probably the most perplexing epic name of anything is a heavy story-based hack-and-slash adventure game based on the popular Japanese manga Berserk. Thankfully, you don't have to have any previous knowledge of the manga to understand what's going on here, and this one's a hell of a fun ride. The gameplay is solid, the graphics are nice, the violence is high, and the story is deeper than you expect and pretty involved. I'd love to see a sequel to this great game that's stuck with me over the years, but given it's been over 20 years and virtually nobody on this side of the pond talks or even knows about it, I doubt that will ever happen. Still, definitely worth checking out though. SegaGaGa, or SGGG, I call it SGGG, is quite possibly the weirdest game on this list, and this is a list that has Typing of the Dead and Seaman on it. It's the only game on this list that was never released in North America and is described as a Sega simulation. It's a JRPG where you play as a kid off the street in a future Tokyo who gets hired at Sega in their new SegaGaGa department to help save the struggling company from losing to its rival, the suspiciously Sony-like Dogma, who owns 97% of the console market. Sound familiar? Gameplay involves battling employees and other characters throughout various Sega development studios, some being taken from older game franchises like Sonic, Golden Axe, and more. It features many tongue-in-cheek references to Sega and the video game industry, particularly Sony and the PS2. The parallels to real life and the sheer batshit insanity in this game are an absolute blast. It almost comes across as a swan song love letter to Sega fans. Sega knew they were on the way out, so they made a game about it. The game has been all but impossible to play if you don't speak Japanese for years due to it being so text heavy. But a recent AI translator feature addition to RetroArch has finally made it possible for we English speakers to experience this insanely out there piece of history.
The Dreamcast library is varied to say the least, and while I would suggest any of the games on this list, there's so many more great games on the platform that still stand up till today, just waiting to be discovered by a new generation.
In retrospect, the Dreamcast has been regarded as one of the greatest consoles of all time that continued Sega's history of releasing very interesting, if not always successful, games that some declare as ahead of their time. I, like many, look back at the Dreamcast as an awesome, forward-thinking, revolutionary console. It feels as if its life was cut short because it was. Before the console could fail, Sega pulled out, leaving everyone who purchased the console to feel like there was so much more mileage left in it.
While I do believe the console was great, one of the reasons I think that it's looked back at as so flawless is that it was with us for such a short period of time, and it was never given a chance to fail. Would it have failed? Honestly, probably yeah.
But this was the odd case where we didn't get to witness this failure. So it was, or is, hard for us, the consumers, to see how it would have. Sega literally ended its run, leaving us wanting more, which is something you want to do with a TV or film series, end on a high note before things go south and burn out. However, this is something that just doesn't happen in the console space. It seemed as if things were going well, and they were to a degree, but Sega did see the dark times ahead and decided to call it before they got there.
Could they have come out on top had they hung around? As much as I love Sega and the Dreamcast, probably not.
So while it's a tough pill to swallow, it probably was the best move. Even though I don't think I, as an avid Dreamcast fan, will ever be able to totally accept that.
So in the meantime, I will continue to wear my rose-tinted glasses when looking back at the Dreamcast, and remember all the awesome memories it brought me. It still does till this day. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Dreamcast, and why it was Sega's most successful failure. I hope you enjoyed this video in my 5-part series about the Dreamcast. I want to thank all my Patreons out there. Without you guys' support, videos like this would not be possible. And a special thanks to my top tier members, Marge G and Silverlock. You guys rock. If you want to support the channel, consider hitting the like and subscribe button. If you want to do a bit more, check out the exclusive benefits over on my Patreon. And until next time, you're beautiful, you're awesome, and I love every single one of you. Thanks for watching.